Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Kathy Volkman. I'm Curator of Artifacts here at the Historical Society, and we are glad that you all came out on this kind of dismal October afternoon. I will introduce our speaker, Scott Norrick. His passion is connecting people to their past. With over 30 years of family history research experience, he is familiar with all of the latest and time-tested genealogical tools, which we all need. His areas of expertise include research in the American Midwest, along with the immigration to the Midwest from European countries. He is a member of the Association of Professional Genealogists and manages his own company, Ancestral Past. So please join me in welcoming Scott.
Thank you. Well, I'm excited to be with you guys today, so thank you for coming. Again, my name is Scott Norrick. And as she said, I've been researching my own family history for over 30 years, but more recently started my company, Ancestral Past, where I help others, research their family history. And to me, good family history and good genealogy is about a lot more than just putting together a list of dates, names, and places, but really trying to understand the stories and the context of how our ancestors live, and that's what I enjoy getting into. And that's kind of what prompted me to dig in to do these analyses of the 1950 census for an entire community. So I kind of started doing that with my own family. I had a grandfather who had passed away before I was born, so I never met him. But I knew he always lived his entire life in this small rural area of southern Indiana. And I had known that he left school after 8th grade to go work in the coal mines at age 14, and he worked in the coal mines his entire life. So when the 1950 census came out, he was still alive in 1950, I found him in the census, and sure enough, it showed him as having an 8th grade education and working in the coal mine. But as I started looking at the other adult men on the pages around him, I saw that almost every adult man just had an 8th grade education, and they all worked in the coal mines. And I looked at the entire county then and saw for this little rural county he lived in, more than half of the men had an 8th grade or less education, and more than half of the men worked in the coal mines. So where I was always wondering how he made the decisions he made, it was really based on the time and place he grew up. That was kind of what was expected of young men at that time. So I like looking at census not only for researching individual ancestors, but also trying to see if we can paint a picture of what life was like in that community at that time. So what we're going to do today is take a snapshot. The snapshot is the official census date for 1950 was April 1st. So everyone in the United States that was living on April 1st should be found somewhere in the 1950 census, and it should give us information on where they lived, education levels, where they were born, family status, and then for select people it also gives income, education, and military service information. So look forward to digging in and seeing if we can paint a picture of 1950 Marathon County. So just a quick overview, spend just a couple of minutes talking about the background of the 1950 census. We'll talk about 1950 in context in terms of what was going on overall in the United States at the time. It's a very dynamic time. We'll look at the Marathon County districts I researched. So I took a sample of Marathon County residents to come up with the data that we'll look at, and so I'll show you how I took that sample. We'll look at how the data from Marathon County compares to other Wisconsin and Midwest communities. So I've done a similar analysis on a number of other Wisconsin counties as well as other counties throughout the Midwest. So we'll be able to do a comparison there. One thing that we will see is within Marathon County, and this is typical, I usually see this in most counties, is that a lot of the data differs depending on whether you lived in a city versus living in the rural areas. So a lot of the information really is contrasting depending on whether you lived in a rural community or not. So we'll look how that breaks out for this county. We'll look at the interesting employment findings. There were 2 employment questions on the 1950 census. For everyone that was over 14 years of age that had a job, it asked what their job title was and what industry they worked in. And so we'll look at that data for the county. It doesn't tell you what the name of the company someone works for, but it tells you what industry they work in. We'll look at the origin and parent origin information. Every single person was asked where they were born, and so we'll look at that data. And then 1 out of every 5 people was asked where their parents were born, and so we'll look at that as well. Other interesting findings, and then again, this generally goes about 45 minutes or so, and we'll leave the last 10 or 15 minutes open for Q&A.
Was there any, did you say you could ask during?
Sure, yeah.
Is there anything uniquely original in this census different than the prior?
Yes. Yes. So the first thing on here is you see that the United States has done a census for America every 10 years going back to 1790. That very first census in 1790 basically just gave the name of the head of the household and where they lived. There wasn't much more information than that, and then the number of people that lived in the household. And in that original census, and the reason Congress started the census was to determine how many members of the U.S. House of Representatives each state would have based on the population. So the original census was just sort of a head count, but it's evolved over the years, and now as of 1950, which is the most recent census that's available to us, there are a lot of questions on it. But every 10 years, the government's changed the questions that are on there. So some of the questions in 1950 were identical to the ones in 1940, but some were different. And we'll look at a sample. One of the reasons why we're just now able to see the 1950 census is Congress put in what they call a 72-year rule for privacy purposes, that censuses aren't released to the public until 72 years after the census was taken. So I mentioned April 1st, 1950 was the 1950 census date. So on April 1st of last year, 2022, is the first time that the public could take a look at the 1950 census data. So the government has done a census every 10 years since 1950. We just don't have access to look at the data from 1960 onwards. One of the other things that's important to point out is in 1950, the census was still done basically 100% by individuals that the government hired, census takers, going around and knocking on every door and every farm and personally asking the questions and writing down the answers on a big sheet of paper. More recently, you know, the government uses the internet and email to get a lot of that data. For 1960 through 1990, it was primarily the U.S. mail, and you would only get visited by a census taker if you didn't send those forms back in. But in 1950, it was all done face-to-face. Because of that, there are errors in the census. So any of you that have looked at old census data, sometimes the census taker misspells a name or he gets an age wrong. Sometimes if that family was not home and he came back a second time and they still weren't home, he might get the information from your neighbor. If the neighbor knew a lot about your family, the census taker could actually get information on you and your family from a neighbor. But that also can create some errors from time to time. But in general, I think the census is pretty accurate. It also sometimes creates some humorous things, and if you've looked at a lot of census data, you've probably seen some humorous names. So given that we have the holidays coming up, I've just printed out here 2 excerpts from census, different names. Neither one of these is from Wisconsin. So this one is from the state of Indiana, but I found the Christmas family who had a daughter named Mary, so I found Merry Christmas in the census. And then for Halloween on the far right in Oklahoma, there was the Stein family who had a gentleman named Frank, and his middle initial was N. So I found Frankenstein in the census as well. But you also find the future famous, and I will tell you, there's no one that was living in the U.S. in 1950 that I've looked for in the census and have not been able to find them. So sometimes you have to really search to find them, but I've been able to find everyone that I've looked for so far. And here again, I just give you 3 more excerpts. These are all gentlemen that were young men in 1950 that went on to become famous, but they weren't famous at the time. The top third there is from Atlanta, Georgia, the King family. 21-year-old son, Martin Luther Jr. His dad was a Baptist minister. This middle one is from Scranton, Pennsylvania. We have the Biden family, and you see 7-year-old Joseph Biden Jr. His dad was an automotive inspector. One of the interesting things here is I highlighted Joe Biden's uncle Frank was living with them, and if you look at his job title over to the far right, he was actually one of the enumerators, which is the census taker. So Joe Biden's uncle was one of the guys that was going around knocking on the doors to prepare the 1950 census. And then finally, the bottom one here from New York City and Manhattan, we have the Trump family, and we have little 4-year-old Donald. His dad owned a building construction business. His mother was born in Scotland, and they had an Irish nursemaid living with them. So you do find just about everyone you're looking for that was alive in 1950 in the census. So before we dig into Marathon County, just briefly some of the things that were going on in 1950. It was obviously a dynamic time. This was the first census after World War II. The U.S. population was about 150 million at the time. It's more than double that today. So again, the U.S. was less than half the size of what it is today. The population of Marathon County in 1950 was 80,000. And it's not quite doubled in that time, but obviously quite a bit larger than that today. 1950 was the year the Korean War started, although it didn't start until the summer of 1950, and I mentioned that April 1st was the census date. So we're going to look at some military information. The Korean War had not started quite yet as the time the census was taken, but we'll look at World War II and World War I info. Obviously, cost of living was very different. Average home price under $8,500. Average wages were about $3,200. It was the year that TV sets really started taking off. 14 million TV sets sold in the United States. That was 10 times the number of TV sets that were sold in 1949. It was the year that the first credit cards were issued. It was the birth year of Jay Leno, Stevie Wonder, Bill Murray, Julius Erving, African American, played in the NBA for the first time. And Curly Lambeau started as the Green Bay Packer coach in 1919, and so after 31 seasons, he left the Packers in 1950. So just a little backdrop of some of the things that were going on. But again, I mentioned that it was the first census after World War II. You had all these returning servicemen that were benefiting from the GI Bill, which gave college education opportunities to returning servicemen, and it also offered subsidized home loans to returning servicemen. And that really helped spur the economy. More people started going to college. Many more people were able to afford homes. Obviously, the automobile was coming into its own, and there was a real construction boom going on of new homes. Suburbs were starting, new roads. So it was a very dynamic time in the U.S. and obviously in Marathon County as well. And it was really the time, when baby boomers were starting to be born in big numbers, so that continued to fuel the construction boom. A lot of new schools were being built, in the 1950s as well. So just to give a little more feel for 1950, I just went back to an old Daily Record Herald newspaper and printed off some of the ads that were in the paper from that period of time. Thought you might find some of these interesting. Upper left, you see Marathon City Beer. I had not heard of that beer. I looked it up. It looked like they brewed from 1881 to 1966. The bottom left, this was interesting. Wausau's first washmobile which is a machine that will wash your car. You drive the car through the machine, and Ryan Chevrolet was promoting that. If you had a Chevrolet, they'd wash it for $1.25. If you had another car, it would cost you 50 more cents because it wasn't a Chevy. The Pig and Poke Drive-In, which was a couple blocks south of the city limits on Grand Avenue. We're going to look at the fact that agricultural and the rural part of the county was still very large, in 1950. So you've got a livestock dealer taking an ad out. There was live entertainment at the Hotel Wausau. You could buy a 5-diamond gold ring for $89 from Orwant Jewelers at the time, and then Sipple Department Store on the far right. You could buy a new roller skates for $1.39. So very different time in terms of cost of living, but I found those interesting. So some of you are probably familiar in looking at old US Census data, but I wanted to show you what it looks like. So this is an excerpt from the actual 1950 census form. And the pages of the census are broken into two parts, a top part on each page and a bottom part. On the top part, every person is listed. So you see a listing here of people. And so anyone alive in 1950 should be found somewhere on the top part of the census form. But there were supplemental questions that only 1 out of every 5 people were asked, and that's going to be on the bottom part of the page, and I'll show you the bottom part in a second. But the way that you can find out who is earmarked for those supplemental questions is these little numbers over here that are circled. There's a 1 that's circled, a 6 that are circled. These are the people that are earmarked for the supplemental questions. What I've put here in red going across are the questions that I analyzed that we're going to look at the results for here in a minute. So one of the questions is, do you live on a farm, yes or no? Where were you born? And for that question, you see WIS. If they were born in the United States, the census taker was just to write down the name of the state they were born in. So it doesn't tell you a city, but it will tell you the state they were born in. But if they were not born in the United States, it will tell you what country they were born in. So you see Poland there. And by the way, this form is actually from Stevens Point, so it's not from Wausau, but it is from Stevens Point. But the form is identical for everywhere in the U.S. There was a question on whether you were looking for work or not, yes or no. So I looked at that data, and that's very interesting for this county. And then on the far right, you see job title and industry. So I compiled that data for the county. This then is the bottom part of the census form, which are the supplemental questions. And in 1940 census, you asked about the differences. In 1940, every single person on the 1940 census was asked where their parents were born. But in 1950, only 1 out of every 5 people were asked where their parents were born. And again, this little 1 and this little 6 correspond to those people above. But you see a number of people here whose parents were born in Poland. And this, again, is from Portage County. So I looked at that. I looked at education level. S8, you see, that's an 8th grade education. If you see a C in front of the number, that's college, number of years of college. Then further to the right, you get the income information for the family. And then on the far right is the military service information. Did you serve in World War II? Yes or no? Did you serve in World War I? Yes or no? Or any other military service? So those are the questions that I compiled the data for. I mentioned that I took a sample for Marathon County. I mentioned that the population of the county was about 80,000. And in the sample, I sampled a little over 5,000 people. And I tried to break it out as representative as I could. So obviously the biggest population center for the county is here, Wausau. And that's where almost half of the data that I'm going to look at is coming from, because Wausau was broke into a number of different enumeration districts, and I took data for 4 different enumeration districts that were spread around the city. These 4 townships in the 4 corners kind of that I have, each had about anywhere from 500 to 800 people living in those townships at the time, and I took all of the data from those townships to get a representation of rural life, and then I also took Mosinee down here. So there were 9 townships total that I looked at, 5 of them cities, towns, and 4 of them rural, and that's pretty consistent with the way the total county broke out. The next couple slides are going to get into some numbers, but I'll walk you through them. So there's 3 columns of data. So the first column of data is the combined Marathon County results. And then I've done the similar analysis for a number of other counties in Wisconsin. So I have a Wisconsin average. And then I've also done it for 6 other states in the Midwest, and on the far right you see the Midwest average. So one of the questions is where you were born. So I looked at what percentage of the people were born in the state of Wisconsin for Marathon County. And so 84% of the people living here in 1950 were actually born in the state of Wisconsin. We don't know if they were born in this county, but we know they were born in Wisconsin. That's very consistent with the Wisconsin average and a little bit higher than the Midwest average. 5% of the people were born outside of the U.S. Again, that's consistent with the Wisconsin average, a little bit higher than the Midwest average. Where you see Marathon County a little bit higher is the number of people who had foreign-born parents, so 25%. So 1 out of every 4 parents of people living in Marathon County in 1950 were born outside of the United States. So when you see that difference between a fairly small percentage, 5% to 25% for the parents, that clearly shows you sort of late 1800s, early 1900s was a big migration wave into this area. Average household income, $3,470 for the county. Based on my sample. That was a little bit higher than the Wisconsin average, a little bit lower than the Midwest average. But the one that really jumped out is one of the lowest percentages of people looking for work, 2%. Hardly anyone didn't have a job that wanted a job. And when we look at the industry and employment data, I was really taken back by the number of fairly large employers and the diverse employment base here. So it was a very strong economy in the county in 1950. Average education level. Actually, these 3 questions, average education level, percentage of farms, and World War II service, those 3 almost always correlate with each other in that what I usually see is the higher percentage of farms, number of people living on farms, and 30% of the residents were living on farms in the county. When you see a larger percentage of people on farms, you usually see a slightly lower education level and a slightly lower World War II service. Again, rural areas often didn't have high schools. It was harder for someone to travel a distance to go to high school at that time. And then also, if you grew up on a farm, still during a time where after 8th grade, a lot of people were expected to go work on the farm. Another issue with this education level is this particular question was only asked for those people that are 30 years and older. So if you think about that, this education level is for those people that were born in 1920 or earlier, what was the average education level? But 8th to 9th grade is what I see for a lot of the Midwest. One of the reasons why World War II service is usually a little bit lower for more rural areas is the young men working on the farms, were deemed to be, have jobs that were critical for the U.S. economy, and so more deferments were given to those that were providing for their communities on the farms. I mentioned, though, that there's a big difference in the county between those that lived in the city versus those that lived in the rural area. So I take the same data here and I break it out between those that live in the city and those that live in the rural area, and you really see the differences, in the income levels and the education levels. That's typical. I typically see the cities having the higher income, but I will tell you this disparity is larger than I typically see. And for farming income, it's based on the prior year. So this would have been 1949 for these farmers, what income they were reporting. That 28-24 is a little bit lower than what I typically see for farm income. So my hypothesis is it just wasn't a good crop year, locally in 1949, and the incomes might have been a little bit lower. But almost everywhere I see the rural incomes lower than in the city. And again, if you lived in a rural area, you almost assuredly lived on a farm. 73% of the people that lived in the rural areas lived on a farm in 1950. I mentioned I've done a similar analysis on some other Wisconsin counties, so I show how Marathon County compares to 4 other Wisconsin counties. Wood County is where Wisconsin Rapids is, Portage County is Stevens Point's county, Oneida is Rhinelanders County, and Eau Claire County is obviously where Eau Claire is. You generally see, though, that Marathon County's kind of in the middle of a lot of these stats. Not too many differences across the board, but again, the one that I highlighted is Marathon County, again, had the lowest number of people looking for work, and of all of these counties, it had the most diverse employment base. Which is great for the economy. Average income was kind of in the middle. Percentage of farms was a little bit higher than average, but Portage County actually had a little bit higher percentage of farms. And you see for Portage County and Oneida County, 7% and 6% people looking for work. So the economies weren't quite as strong with jobs in those 2 counties at the time. All right, I mentioned that one of the questions was, what industry do you work in? And so I compiled that data for Marathon County, and this was the top 10. And I put the percentage of people in my sample that worked in that industry. So almost every county I've looked at in the Midwest, farming has been number 1. The only exceptions are the big urban counties like a Milwaukee County, but just about every other county, farming is number 1. So that's not too different, but that's a large number. 31% of those with a job in the county were working on a farm. That's almost 1 out of every 3. Paper mill and insurance, 2 and 3. One of the cool things for me is a lot of these industries still are around today, which is very cool, but a lot of them had gone back to the 1800s, which is very cool. This is probably the county where I've seen, whether you did this list in 1900, 1950, or the year 2000, you're going to see a lot of the same industries on here. For a lot of counties, that's changed more so than here. So paper mills obviously have had a long history in the county going back to the late 1800s. Obviously, Wausau Insurance is still around today. I looked them up, and it looked like they went back to 1911 as the employer's mutual company. Public schools were a large employer. The veneer plant, I think that was probably the Wausau Supply Company, which I think is still around. I think they just celebrated, if I saw right, their 75th anniversary. They opened in 1947, and veneer was one of their top products. Looked like this county's always had a large number of woodworkers, particularly windows and doors. And a lot of those companies opened between the end of World War II and 1950. So when I was researching some of these industries, I found a number of companies that opened in the late 40s. I mentioned Wausau Supply Company, Colby, the window manufacturers, J.M. Kubler, which was another woodworking company, which later became the Marathon Millwork Company. They opened in the 1940s. So again, with all of this construction boom going on in the U.S., new homes in particular, a lot of those jobs were oriented that way in this county. The iron foundry, I don't think that is around anymore, but Wausau Iron Works was built in 1910, and I saw that it closed in 1983. And then Tavern local government construction. But again, a very diverse set of employers. This top 10 group only came up to about half. So, half of all the jobs aren't in an industry that's even on here. So for a lot of these other counties, I do this top 10, and it adds up to about 70 to 80% of the jobs, much more concentration in fewer industries. I think that's one of the reasons why there was lower unemployment here, a very diverse base of employers. Here I show the top 3 employers based on where they lived within the county. Those 4 on the right are all the 4 rural townships. And again, McMillan is sort of in the southwest corner, Reed in the southeast corner, Hewitt in the northeast corner, and Byrne Township in the northwest corner. Those rurals, farming was by far number 1. About 2 out of every 3 jobs in those rural townships were farming. But you see some other interesting industries in here. So again, if you lived in Wausau, number 1 was insurance, followed by paper mill, public school. Mosinee had the same 3, but in a little different order. All the rural townships had farming, but McMillan had the veneer plant, cheese factory. Again, it didn't tell you the name of the cheese factory, but it looked like at least Mullins cheese has been in the county since prior to 1950. I assume some of the people might have been working there. There was a box factory, a number of people in the rural areas worked at, and then, the county's also had a history with the granite quarry, and you see over on the far right, Byrne Township, a number of people working in granite quarry. So good diversity. I just pulled some pictures from about 1950 of some of the employers and some of the sites around Wausau. A lot of these pictures come from the County Historical Society here. The top left, I think, is the old iron foundry. Top middle is just a street scene. That's, I believe, from the corner of 3rd Street in Franklin. Top right was the Employers Mutual headquarters at the time. Bottom left, the paper mill in Wausau. Bottom center, I think that's the Central Grade School. And the bottom right, I got off Colby's website. Colby moved to Wausau in 1948 from Marathon City, and just had a little 2,100 square foot facility initially in the late 40s, and I believe that's a picture of that on the bottom right. I have a business background, so I always enjoy just interesting job titles, so I just threw a list together of some of the interesting job titles that I pulled off of the county's census record. A lot of the interesting job titles usually come from the factories and the manufacturing companies. So the far left in the paper mill, oiler, plugger, takeoff man, beater man, barker man, digester cook. In the veneer plant, you had a log peeler, a door chaser, a log hoister, a grader, a sander, runs the rip saw. Other manufacturing job titles: molder, winder, cementer, slasher, bed setter, mud mixer. Kind of fun. The far right are job titles that I saw a lot of in 1950, but you really don't hear these job titles nearly as much anymore, generally due to technology. Adding machine operator. Obviously, those have kind of gone away with computers. Saw a lot of pin setters. Bowling alleys were still manual for the most part. Usually, young men that would go reset the pins after each frame. A lot of people were employed as telephone operators. That was a very manual job back then. The operator had to plug in the call where it was going. Stenographers and typists were big jobs in 1950. Tabulators in the insurance company, telegrapher on the railroad. Obviously, technology has changed some of these job titles. All right, so I wanted to get to some of the origin questions. I mentioned there were two. One of the questions was, where were you born? And this was asked of everyone. So for Marathon County, the biggest chunk here, 84% of the people were born in the state of Wisconsin. That next smaller slice is 11% of the people were born in the United States, but not in Wisconsin. And then the smallest chunk, 5%, were born outside of the U.S. So on the far right, I basically took the non-Wisconsin 16% and gave you the top 4 answers for where people were born if they weren't born in Wisconsin. Illinois, number 1, followed by Minnesota. Michigan was number 4, but you see Germany was number 3. I almost always see the adjoining states as number 1, number 2. Usually it's adjoining states, the top 4. So Germany, coming in here in the top 4, that's a little unusual, but in Wisconsin you do see that from time to time. There were still a number of Germans moving into the area, in the early 1900s, and this is reflective of that. But again, back in 1950, it was hard to move across the country. So generally when people were moving for jobs, they were moving to an adjacent state, and that's reflective here. The next 4 answers, though, beyond this, Poland was actually number 5. So a lot of people had been born in Poland, followed by Iowa, North Dakota, and then Sweden. So we had 3 foreign countries in the top 8, and that again is a little unusual. This is the breakdown for those, again, that weren't born in the U.S. What were the top countries? If they weren't born in the U.S., over a third of those that were born outside of the U.S. were born in Germany, 35%, followed by Poland. So Germany and Poland combined were more than half. Those were followed by Sweden, Hungary, and Canada. Next countries after those, Austria, Norway, Russia, and Switzerland. So very Germanic, no surprise probably, Eastern Europe and Scandinavia are the countries represented here. The even more interesting question I find, though, is where were your parents born? Because that starts getting back into the immigration trends in the late 1800s. So this is the results for where parents were born. If they were, again, about 1 out of every 4 of the parents were born outside of the U.S., and this shows that breakdown. Exactly half were Germany, followed by Poland, Sweden, Canada, Norway, Russia, which is interesting, Hungary, and Austria. Probably no surprise to any of you that know the background of the county that Germany and Poland are 1 and 2. But even in 1950, you still see those Germanic countries in Eastern Europe. Obviously, if you did this today, it would look very, very different. But again, this was back in 1950, where those immigration trends were from. Yeah.
Didn't break down any Native American. Obviously, if people were Native American, they were born in Wisconsin, they wouldn't have showed up as a percentage.
Right.
Thank you.
That's correct. It's not a question I looked at, but on the very first page, there was a question of race. And if you see NA on there, that does mean that someone is Native American. But it's not one of the questions I tabulated. But I did see there were a fair number of Native Americans in the county. Not a huge number, but in the sample there were. But it's not a breakout in terms of where they were born. So I wanted to also then show you how this same question breaks out by the various parts of the county, right? So it's not the same in all of the different townships and parts of the county. So again, you see the same breakout of Wausau, Mosinee, and then the 4 rural townships. Germany's number 1 across the board, except for in Reed Township. Actually, Poland and Russia came up more often than Germany in that township. And again, that township is in the southeast part of the county. But Germany was 3rd there. Other countries that came up, Norway was number 3 for Wausau, followed by Sweden. So in the city of Wausau, obviously Scandinavia, right after Germany. And Canada, you see on here quite a bit. Obviously, this is far enough north that a number of people were born in Canada. But my sense was that a lot of those Canadians originally had family roots in these same set of countries. Hungary, you see on there in Hewitt Township. That's one you don't always see in big numbers. And then Switzerland, the Bern Township on the far right there, which is in the northwest corner, very Germanic. Number 1, 2, and 3, all German-speaking countries, Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. And then I did the same thing for just a quick comparison of the other Wisconsin counties that I've done the similar analysis. Germany number 1 in most of the counties, except Portage, actually Poland just slightly edged out Germany in my sample of Portage County. And when you get over closer to Minnesota, like where Eau Claire is, you start seeing Scandinavia surpass Germany. Certainly when you look at the state of Minnesota, which I've done some counties in Minnesota, either Norway or Sweden are usually number 1 or 2, followed by Germany. And in Eau Claire, Norway was 1, Germany 2. But Germany was either 1 or 2 in every county. And again, very much Germanic, Eastern Europe, and Scandinavian. Any other surprises with any of these for people? It's probably pretty consistent with what you would guess, I would think.
I'm surprised by all the Hungarians.
Hungarian?
Anyone else?
I'm surprised by the Canadian, I'm surprised by the Canadian, but I think you explained that by saying, if I heard you say that some of the people coming from Canada might have been originally German.
Yeah, so a lot of the German immigrants that came in the late 1800s actually immigrated through Canada, and sometimes they stayed for 5 or 10 years and had kids that that eventually moved down. In the census, it doesn't tell you anything other than Canada, so I'm speculating, but I do know in my research that a lot of the people living in the northern states of the U.S. came in through Canada originally.
I also noticed that when I looked through some of the oral interviews a few years ago, there were French Canadians coming down to Wisconsin as well.
Yeah, obviously, yes. So thank you for saying that. So you don't see France on any of these lists, but obviously Canada is where a lot of French immigrated to, and so some of these Canadians could have been French Canadians that came down into the U.S. The only other Western Europe country you see on here is Holland, over in Dodge and Jefferson County, which is where Watertown is. Holland came up, but you don't see Ireland, Italy, Scotland, and that's, and I've done this work in Milwaukee and Madison. In the bigger cities, you see more of them, but in the smaller counties, in particular the rural areas, it's pretty Germanic and Eastern Europe with Scandinavia as well. So in summary, as I summarize the data I looked at, in most measures, Marathon looked like a typical Wisconsin and Midwest county. The exceptions, though, a higher percentage of people living on farms, and that resulted in a slightly lower education level, slightly lower likelihood of serving in World War II. But there was a very diverse base of both blue and white collar employment. And a lot of that is still here today. You know, I had Eau Claire up there, so the number behind farming in Eau Claire County, number 2 employer in 1950 was a tire factory. One of the largest tire factories in the U.S. was in Eau Claire. And I want to say about 25% of the people worked at that factory, but that closed. Can't remember if it was in the I think it was in the 80s. But when so many people work in one industry and then that industry leaves or shuts down, it really hits a community hard. You know, this county has been a little more insulated from that. Farming, paper mill, insurance, the top 3 employers, followed by the veneer plant and woodworking. And then Germany and Poland were by far the top 2 countries of origin for foreign-born parents, followed by Sweden, Canada, and Norway. If any of you have interest in doing more research on the 1950 or earlier census, I just wanted to give you some of the places, more common places where you can go and look up the census information. Ancestry.com is probably the most popular to look at census data, but that is a subscription service, although most libraries have free access to it. But FamilySearch.org is a free site run by the Latter-day Saints that has all the census data on there. You do have to register, but it is free. And then archives.gov is the U.S. government site, which also has the census data. Its search feature is not quite as strong as the others. And then finally, if you do have questions after today, I'm going to open it up for questions now, but if you have questions after today, my email address is scott@ancestralpast.com. I'm always happy to respond to questions. But let's open it up.
Okay. And we also do have a sign-up sheet in the back if you want to give Scott your email so he can put you on his email list of interesting and helpful tips and topics.
Yeah, so I send an email about once a month on a family history topic, and if you want to get that email, just put your name on the list, and I'd be happy to send it to you.
Okay. We'll take questions.
Thank you. Were census done in the jails, in the penitentiaries?
Yes, they were. Yes. So she asked whether if people were in a penitentiary or a jail, whether they'd be included in the census, and they are. I don't recall in Marathon County any particular of my subset sample that included those, but I've had plenty of other counties, you know, where just every inmate is listed with all of their information.
I assume they were.
Yeah. Mental hospitals, the same way. More people, it was more common for people to be institutionalized, you know, in 1950, so you have a lot of people wondering about that as well, but everyone is listed in 1950. It's a good question.
How could we look at the 1950 census?
Well, again, it is all available on these websites. So on all 3 of these websites, they have a search feature. And you can search generally either by name or location. And sometimes, you know, it takes a while, but if you are diligent, like I said, I've been able to find everyone that I've looked for. If the person has a very common name, it's going to be a little harder. Obviously, there were tens of thousands of Bob Smiths, you know. So if they have a very common name, it's probably going to be important for you to know where they lived as well, what town. It helps.
Our library does have Ancestry.
So he said that the local library does have the library version of Ancestry.com, which would allow them to search for free the census data. And in my experience, Ancestry's got the best search feature for searching the census data.
Just a curious question. How did they decide which of those which of the fifth, 1 out of every 5? How did the census makers decide which of those? They're not going to ask children. How did they decide which of every 5?
It was just random. So on the census form, the census taker is to go to every household, and they're always to start with the head of the household, which at that time, they kind of defined as the man of the house. So things have changed in that way as well. But it starts with the head of the household, then usually their spouse, then children by order of age, and then anyone else living. And it's whichever person lines up on that every 5th box. So it was very random, and it could be a child. It could have been someone that was born on April 1st. And then you'll just see that they were born that day, and obviously education, military service, and all that's not applicable. But there are children included in those supplemental questions as well. But it was completely random.
I think you said something about US Insurance, which hasn't existed for about 25 years. And also, my family's got tavern keeper. I'm surprised as many taverns were in Wausau that only 1% were in the tavern business.
Huh. Yeah. Well, I tell you, I generally don't see tavern make the top 10 list, but in Wisconsin, I occasionally do, which is a great thing. Yeah, it was top 10 for the county. I don't recall for Wausau where it ended up. So you said that Wausau Insurance Company hasn't existed for 25 years, but it's primarily been due to buyouts and name changes, right? There still is a pretty good insurance presence. No insurance presence here? I thought there was still.
Maybe out of their home, they work out of their home for Nationwide or
Yeah.
Mutual or some such thing, but
No jobs. Okay.
No, Aspirus is in that building now. What once was Insurance, the hospital's past.
Okay.
I was going to mention I've been able to find some information on findagrave.com.
Yeah.
So that's another source if somebody's starting to look for their families or friends or neighbors or whatever.
Yeah, so she brought up a website called findagrave.com, which started and is still primarily a website of cemeteries and tombstones, but people are able to add information for individuals. So if you search in Find a Grave for one of your ancestors, if someone's put in the information, you're oftentimes taken to a picture of their tombstone. Oftentimes there might be an obituary attached to it, and there might be more information as well. Those generally would not have the census information on there, but it is a good place to search for ancestors. And that's findagrave.com.
So Congress dictated the 72 years based partly on privacy. Now that people are living longer, do you foresee that that time frame is going to change? Because, I mean, even in the 1950 census, there are people alive who were listed in facilities, like I found one for epilepsy, for example, and it identified the people there.
Yeah, I have not heard that there hasn't been a movement that I've heard of to extend that period of time, but I've wondered that as well. And I will tell you that in England, and I believe Canada as well, it's a 90-year window. So in those countries, they're just getting the 1930 era census. So we have a shorter period of time than some of other countries. But I've not heard that there's been a movement. There's actually, I've heard a lot of people argue for less time, but I don't think that's going to happen. Those are just mostly researchers that just want to see the info. But particularly given that there's income information, the big reason they put, another reason they want the 72 years is that when they ask the questions, they want people to answer honestly. And I don't know, 72 is an odd number, so I've never understood how that's not 70 or 75, so I don't know why it was 72. But over time, they may push that back as people are living longer.
Oh, one more. Wait till I come back.
What can you share about the Wisconsin state census that were taken many years ago? I don't think they've done them for quite a while. Is that a good source of records? And who would it be like Ancestry again that would be your best source for those state census records?
Yeah, so he's asking about the Wisconsin state census, and I forget the particulars, but I'll tell you what I know is, so most states have not done state censuses, but Iowa and Wisconsin are two in the Midwest that for a period of time did a state census. In general, they did those in years that end in 5. So the US government does it every 10 years, and there are some states, New York was probably the most extensive, that for maybe a 30 or 40 year period, they were doing a state census on the halfway point between the US Census. Those were generally late 1800s, early 1900s, and the answer to your question is yes. Those are out on both Ancestry.com and FamilySearch.org as well. A lot of the questions are similar on the U.S. Census. What I generally find on the state census is particularly for states like Wisconsin, they ask more agricultural questions. So you might see questions on there, how many farm animals live on your farm? How many bushels of corn do you grow a year? You see very specific questions like that in some of the state censuses.
There was a census that was destroyed mostly. What year was that?
Yeah, 1890. So I mentioned the U.S. government has done a census every 10 years, and that's true. They did a full census in 1890, but in the early 1900s, there was a fire that was in the building that had all the original documents from 1890, and less than 1% of those survive today. And it was a few select counties, primarily in the South. So generally, if you're looking for an ancestor in 1890, you're not going to find them on a U.S. census. I will tell you, though, for those states that did the state census, that's where it becomes very helpful, because most of my relatives lived in Indiana during the late 1800s. I have to go all the way from 1880 to 1900 to find them on any census.
Okay, whoop. That's okay.
The participation rate for World War II, 6% seems low. I would have guessed that to be almost double or triple. Is that because of every 5?
So
we'll ask that question?
Yes. So even children are in that sample. So it's not 6% of those men of the eligible age. It's 6% of the entire county population served in World War II. So the highest that I've seen for a county is around 10. So I don't see it get much above that. But it's sort of 5 to 10% is the range, and this county was on the lower end of the range. But generally, the agricultural counties I see on the lower end.
Okay, with that, we're going to wrap it up. Thank you very much, Scott.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.